The AI will learn all your processes, Rebecca. My boss smiled, not quite meeting my eyes. We're paying $300,000 for the system. It would be fiscally irresponsible to keep paying your salary, too. Your position simply won't exist after the transition. I stared at the termination letter on his desk, the golden watch they'd given me last month for my 18-year work anniversary still gleaming on my wrist. 18 years of building their enterprise software infrastructure from scratch, erased by an algorithm with a marketing brochure and a steep price tag. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning began like any other in my 18-year career at Horizon Systems. I arrived at 7:15 a.m., precisely 45 minutes before most of the development team would start trickling in. These early moments were precious, time to run system diagnostics, review overnight logs, and prepare for the day's priorities without interruption. As senior systems architect, I'd established this routine years ago, finding that these quiet, morning hours often revealed issues before they could escalate into full-blown crises. The enterprise software infrastructure I'd designed for Horizon served over 300 corporate clients across the healthcare sector. What had begun as a simple database solution had evolved into an intricate, interconnected ecosystem handling everything from patient records to billing systems to regulatory compliance. The architecture wasn't just code and servers. It was an extension of my problem-solving approach, built through years of experience, mistakes, corrections, and innovations. My desk reflected this history, surrounded by technical diagrams I'd created to help new team members visualize the system's complexity, awards from industry conferences where I'd presented our solutions, and a small collection of thank you notes from clients whose critical problems I'd solved during weekend emergencies or holiday disruptions. "Morning, Rebecca," called Ethan, the newest member of our security team, his arrival unusually early. I'd been mentoring him for the past 6 months, gradually transferring knowledge about our proprietary authentication protocols and vulnerability management procedures. "You're here early," I noted, glancing up from my monitors where I was reviewing an anomaly in the overnight processing logs. "Big deployment day," he replied with enthusiasm. "Wanted to get a head start on those security certificates we discussed yesterday." I nodded approvingly. At 26, Ethan represented the new generation of tech talent. Brilliant, eager, and specially trained in emerging technologies. I'd fought to have him assigned to my team despite his limited experience, seeing potential that reminded me of myself at that age. The difference, of course, was that when I joined Horizon at 27, the cloud was still primarily a meteorological phenomenon. Machine learning was largely theoretical, and the infrastructure I now managed existed only as primitive fragments. By 8:30 a.m., the office hummed with activity. I finished documenting the overnight anomaly, a minor data synchronization issue I'd already resolved, and prepared for my weekly meeting with Michael Voss, the CTO. These meetings had evolved from technical reviews to strategic planning sessions, as my role expanded beyond implementing solutions to helping shape the company's technological direction. I gathered my laptop and notes, taking a moment to check my calendar for the day's remaining commitments. There was nothing unusual listed for the 9 a.m. meeting with Michael, just the standard weekly systems review that had occupied this time slot for years. Michael's executive assistant smiled as I approached the glass-walled conference room. "He asked if you could meet in his office today instead," she informed me, something in her expression suggesting she knew more than she was saying. "Is everything okay?" I asked, recalibrating my expectations. "As far as I know," she replied with professional neutrality. "He's waiting for you." Michael's office occupied the corner of our floor, offering panoramic views of the city skyline, a visible reminder of Horizon's success and growth over the years. Through those windows, I could see the hospital complex where our systems managed millions of patient interactions annually, the research center whose clinical trials depended on our data processing capabilities, and the university where I occasionally guest lectured on enterprise architecture. As I entered, I noticed immediately that Michael wasn't alone. Vivian Chen, the newly appointed CEO who had taken over 3 months earlier, sat beside him. Also present was someone I didn't recognize, a man in his early 40s wearing the polished but slightly generic look of a high-level consultant. "Rebecca, thanks for coming in," Michael began, gesturing to an empty chair across from the group. "You know Vivian, of course, and this is James Elliott from Neurosphere Technologies." I nodded politely, taking the offered seat while processing this unexpected scenario. Neurosphere was one of the emerging players in enterprise AI solutions. I'd read their white papers and even attended a demonstration of their system at a conference last year. Technically impressive, but like most AI implementations I'd evaluated, better at specialized tasks than at understanding the nuanced interdependencies of complex systems. "We've asked James to join us because we've been in discussions about an exciting new direction for Horizon," Michael continued, his tone carrying the forced enthusiasm I recognized from previous announcements that masked significant organizational changes. Vivian leaned forward, her expression calibrated to convey both determination and empathy, a CEO's standard toolkit for difficult conversations. "Rebecca, let me start by acknowledging your tremendous contributions to Horizon. The infrastructure you've built has been the backbone of our growth for nearly 2 decades. The past tense wasn't subtle. My stomach tightened as I maintained my professional composure, years of crisis management helping me mask the sudden surge of adrenaline. "Thank you," I replied simply, waiting for the actual purpose of this meeting to emerge. "As you know, the industry is evolving rapidly," Vivian continued. "AI implementation is no longer optional for companies that want to remain competitive. After extensive analysis, we've determined that integrating Neurosphere's adaptive enterprise system represents our best path forward." James nodded, apparently his cue to join the conversation. "Our AES platform can automate approximately 87% of current systems management functions, while reducing operational costs by an estimated 42%, he explained, his delivery suggesting he'd presented these figures countless times. "The system continuously learns from operational patterns, adapts to changing conditions, and eliminates the inefficiencies inherent in human oversight." The implication hung in the air for a moment before Michael cleared his throat. "We've signed a contract with Neurosphere to implement their AES across our entire infrastructure," he said, unable to maintain eye contact. "The transition will begin immediately." I processed this information, my mind already calculating the practical challenges such a transition would present. "That's an ambitious timeline," I observed carefully. "I assume you'll want my team to collaborate with Neurosphere's engineers on the knowledge transfer and integration planning." A glance passed between Michael and Vivian, the kind of nonverbal communication that confirms one's worst suspicions. "The AI will learn all your processes, Rebecca," Vivian stated, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We're paying $300,000 for the system. It would be fiscally irresponsible to keep paying your salary, too. Your position simply won't exist after the transition." The statement landed with clinical precision. 18 years of institutional knowledge, relationship building, and dedicated service reduced to a redundant budget line. "I see," I replied, my voice steady despite the surge of emotions beneath. "And my team?" "Ethan will stay on as the AI liaison," Michael explained. "He has the right background in machine learning to facilitate the transition. The rest of the systems team will be evaluated based on skill alignment with our new technological direction." Translation. The youngest, least expensive member of my team would remain, while others with decades of combined experience would likely follow me out the door. The calculation was brutally simple. Why maintain a team of specialized human experts when an algorithm promised the same results at a fraction of the cost? "When does this take effect?" I asked, mentally cataloging the numerous undocumented aspects of our infrastructure that existed only in my experience and understanding. "We'll need 2 weeks for knowledge transfer," James interjected. "The AES system requires initial pattern recognition data to establish baseline operational parameters, so I'm expected to train my replacement," I clarified, the irony not lost on me. "We prefer to think of it as documenting your legacy," Vivian responded smoothly. "Your contributions won't be forgotten, Rebecca. They'll be integrated into a system that will serve Horizon for years to come." The meeting continued with details of the severance package, generous by industry standards, a testament to my long service, and transition protocols. Throughout, I maintained professional composure, asking relevant questions about timeline, scope, and expectations. Years of handling system crises had taught me to compartmentalize emotional responses until they could be processed privately. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my notes with the same precision I applied to code reviews and system documentation. "I'll need access to the AES technical specifications to ensure proper knowledge transfer," I stated, already identifying potential failure points in the proposed transition. "Of course," James replied, seemingly relieved by my apparent cooperation. "I'll have the documentation sent over immediately." Back at my desk, I sat momentarily motionless, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Around me, the development floor continued its normal rhythm, unaware that the technological foundation they depended on daily was about to undergo radical transformation. My phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Everything okay? You were in with the brass for a while." I considered how to respond. Ethan wasn't just a colleague, but someone I'd personally mentored and advocated for. How much loyalty did I owe Horizon now versus the responsibility I felt toward those I'd guided professionally? Before I could decide, Michael appeared beside my desk, his discomfort evident. "We'd appreciate discretion until the formal announcement tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "I know this is difficult, Rebecca, but technology evolves. You understand that better than anyone." "I understand economic calculations, Michael," I replied evenly. "What I question is whether those calculations have accurately accounted for all variables." He shifted uncomfortably. "The analysis was thorough. Neurosphere has implemented their system successfully at organizations larger than ours. With infrastructure they designed from the beginning," I pointed out. "Not with systems that evolved organically over 18 years, adapted to specific client needs with countless custom modifications. The AI is designed to learn those nuances," he insisted. "That's what the knowledge transfer period is for." I nodded, recognizing the futility of this conversation. Michael wasn't a technical leader anymore, hadn't been for years. His decisions now were driven by spreadsheets and board expectations rather than technological realities. "I'll prepare comprehensive documentation," I assured him, the consummate professional to the end. As he walked away, I turned to my computer and began systematically archiving 18 years of notes, documentation, and institutional knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career building systems designed to preserve and protect critical information, and now I was preparing the extraction of my own contributions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By late afternoon, the AES technical documentation had arrived in my inbox. I reviewed it with the critical eye developed through decades of systems architecture, immediately identifying fundamental misconceptions about enterprise infrastructure management embedded in its design. The system was impressive, even revolutionary, in certain aspects, but it approached complex systems as though they were merely complicated. Anyone with deep experience knew the critical difference between those concepts. As evening approached, I received another message from Ethan. Team. Dinner tonight? My treat. The invitation suggested he'd been informed of his new role, and likely of my impending departure. I accepted with a brief reply, then continued my methodical preparation of knowledge transfer documents. At 6:30 p.m., I powered down my workstation and gathered my personal items, a small plant given to me on my 10th anniversary with the company, a collection of technical books that had guided my professional development, and the framed photograph of our team celebrating the successful deployment of our largest system upgrade 3 years earlier. I left the industry awards and recognition plaques that hung on the wall. Those belonged to Horizon's history now. The restaurant Ethan had chosen was quiet and dimly lit, the kind of place where conversations remained private. He was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, his expression confirming my suspicions. They told you, I stated simply, sliding into the booth across from him. He nodded, genuine distress evident in his features. This afternoon, I tried to argue against it, Rebecca. I told them the AES can't possibly understand all the interconnections and dependencies you manage. But you accepted the liaison position. I observed without judgment. Yes, he admitted, his discomfort visible. They made it clear the alternative was joining the rest of the team in the layoffs. I nodded, understanding his position. At 26, with student loans and a career just beginning, principled resignation wasn't a realistic option. I would have advised you to take it, I assured him. The relief in his expression was immediate. I still feel like I'm betraying you. Everything I know about our systems, I learned from you. You're not betraying me, Ethan. You're surviving a corporate decision that has nothing to do with either of us personally. This is about balance sheets and investor perceptions, not technology. Our conversation continued through dinner, shifting from the emotional impact of the restructuring to practical concerns about the transition. Despite my imminent departure, I found myself coaching him on potential challenges the AI implementation would face, identifying critical junction points where human insight would still be necessary. The authentication handshake between the claims processing module and the regulatory compliance system, I explained, sketching a diagram on a napkin. It was implemented during the encryption update 3 years ago, but it relies on a proprietary protocol that isn't documented in the standard system specifications. Ethan took notes diligently. Where would I find the documentation for that? You wouldn't, I replied. It exists in my head and in the code itself. I'll document it during the knowledge transfer, but the underlying logic, why it was designed, that way, rather than using standard protocols, that's harder to capture. His expression grew increasingly concerned as I outlined several similar examples, critical system elements that functioned through a combination of code, institutional knowledge, and experience-based intuition rather than formal documentation. How is the AI supposed to understand all this in 2 weeks? He asked finally. That's the question, isn't it? I responded, meeting his gaze directly. The fundamental misconception in Neurosphere's approach is that systems architecture is merely a technical discipline. In reality, it's the intersection of technology, organizational history, client relationships, and industry context. Some of that can be documented and learned, but much of it is tacit knowledge developed through years of experience. As we finished dinner, Ethan's earlier enthusiasm about his new role had visibly diminished, replaced by a more realistic appreciation of the challenges ahead. What will you do? He asked as we prepared to leave. The question had been circling in my mind throughout the day, competing with more immediate concerns about the knowledge transfer process. At 45, I was simultaneously highly qualified and potentially obsolete in an industry increasingly captivated by AI solutions. I have options, I replied with more confidence than I felt. 18 years of enterprise architecture experience doesn't disappear overnight, regardless of current trends. We parted with a promise to meet for coffee outside of work hours, his genuine respect evident despite the awkward circumstances. As I drove home through the quiet evening streets, the emotional reality I'd held at bay throughout the day finally emerged. 18 years. Nearly half my life dedicated to building and maintaining systems that had become essential infrastructure for hundreds of healthcare organizations. Countless weekends sacrificed to emergency patches, holidays interrupted by critical updates, middle-of-the-night phone calls about system anomalies. Not just work, but a professional identity carefully constructed through dedication, continuous learning, and proven reliability. My apartment felt unusually quiet as I entered, the space that had primarily served as a place to sleep between workdays suddenly the center of my existence. On the refrigerator, a save-the-date magnet reminded me of a colleague's wedding next month, a social connection soon to be severed by my departure from Horizon. I moved to my home office, powered up my personal laptop, and began a methodical inventory of my professional network, financial position, and skill portfolio. If I approached this transition with the same analytical rigor I applied to systems architecture, perhaps I could navigate it successfully. Contact information for former colleagues now at other companies, connections from industry conferences, and technical forums, certifications that might need updating to reflect current market demands, financial calculations about how long my severance package would sustain me during a job search or potential career pivot. Past midnight, exhaustion finally overcame determination. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an email notification. The message was from David Zhang, a former Horizon developer who had left 5 years earlier to found a healthcare data analytics startup. Rebecca, heard rumors about AI restructuring at Horizon. If true, we should talk. My team needs someone with your systems understanding. Breakfast tomorrow? David. The message was a small but welcome reminder that 18 years of demonstrated expertise still held value, regardless of current corporate trends. I responded with a brief acceptance, then settled into a sleep less restless than anticipated, the first outlines of a path forward beginning to materialize. The knowledge transfer process would begin tomorrow. 2 weeks of methodically preparing a system to replace me. But beyond that artificial horizon, possibilities remained. The question wasn't whether my skills and experience had value, but where and how that value would be recognized next. The answer wouldn't be found in corporate spreadsheets or AI capability statements, but in the complex human networks and relationships that no algorithm could fully replicate. As I drifted toward sleep, a thought crystallized with unexpected clarity. What Horizon had misunderstood, what Neurosphere's impressive demonstrations had obscured, was that systems architecture wasn't merely about designing technological solutions. It was about creating frameworks that anticipated human needs, accommodated organizational evolution, and gracefully handled the messy, unpredictable nature of real-world problems. That understanding wasn't obsolete, it was essential, regardless of which technologies executed the resulting designs. Tomorrow would begin the process of documenting what could be captured in writing. But the wisdom of when to follow rules versus when to create exceptions, when to prioritize speed versus thoroughness, when to adhere to standards versus crafting custom solutions. That wisdom resided in human judgment honed through years of consequences, both good and bad. No algorithm, however sophisticated, could fully extract or replicate that judgment in 2 weeks of knowledge transfer. With that, realization came surprisingly, a sense of peace. Whatever came next, the value I had built over 18 years remained mine to carry forward. Horizon might be replacing my position, but they couldn't actually replace what I had become through those years of dedicated service. That distinction would become clear enough in the weeks ahead. The morning after my termination meeting dawned with disorienting silence. For the first time in 18 years, my 5:30 a.m. alarm wasn't a call to immediate action. No urgent system reports to review, no early commute to beat traffic, no mental preparation for the day's technical challenges. Instead, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the weight of unemployment pressing down with unexpected force. I silenced the alarm and remained in bed, momentarily paralyzed by the absence of necessity. This strange limbic state, still employed for knowledge transfer purposes but fundamentally dispensable, left me suspended between identities. For nearly 2 decades, I had been Rebecca Chen, Senior Systems Architect at Horizon Systems. Now, I was becoming someone else, someone not yet defined. The realization provoked an almost physical response, a hollowness expanding in my chest. Identity, I was discovering, wasn't simply what you did. It was the accumulated impact of thousands of daily choices, relationships formed through shared challenges, and the satisfaction of seeing your solutions operate in the world. All of that had been severed with clinical precision in yesterday's meeting. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a calendar reminder for my breakfast meeting with David Zhang. The simple notification provided needed structure, a reason to move forward through this unfamiliar morning terrain. I rose and prepared for the day with the same methodical efficiency I applied to system deployments, though the routine felt oddly performative without its usual purpose. David had suggested a quiet cafe near his company's headquarters, about 30 minutes from my apartment. As I drove, I mentally prepared for our conversation, cataloging my transferable skills and knowledge areas while trying to determine what value proposition I might present to his growing startup. The exercise felt both necessary and slightly demeaning. After 18 years of proven expertise, having to consciously articulate my worth seemed like a step backward. The cafe was half full when I arrived, mostly with young professionals starting their day with laptops open and earbuds in place. David spotted me from a corner table and waved me over, his expression conveying genuine warmth. He had been one of my early hires at Horizon, a brilliant developer who had outgrown the constraints of our corporate environment and left to pursue his entrepreneurial ambitions. "Rebecca," he greeted me, rising to offer a quick hug. "It's been too long." "Almost 2 years since your last funding round celebration," I agreed, settling into the chair across from him. "Congratulations on MedPattern's growth. I've been following your progress." David nodded, a flash of pride crossing his features. "It's been exponential this past year, which is partly why I wanted to talk." He paused as a server approached, and we ordered coffee and breakfast. When we were alone again, he continued with characteristic directness. "So, it's true about Horizon implementing Neurosphere's system?" "News travels fast," I observed. "Yes, 2 weeks of knowledge transfer starting today, then my position will be officially eliminated." David shook his head in visible disbelief. "Short-sighted doesn't begin to cover it. Do they genuinely believe an AI system can replicate your understanding of their infrastructure? The architecture you built from scratch?" The validation in his assessment was quietly affirming. "Apparently, so. The calculation is purely financial, my salary versus a one-time system purchase with minimal ongoing costs. And zero understanding of the tacit knowledge that makes those systems actually work," David added, leaning forward. "Which brings me to my proposition. MedPatterns needs someone with your system's architecture expertise. We're scaling rapidly, and our infrastructure is struggling to keep pace." The offer was unexpected in its directness. "I appreciate that, David, but my knowledge is deeply specific to Horizon Systems. Your architecture must be fundamentally different." He smiled slightly. "Different implementation, same fundamental challenges. Healthcare data integration, regulatory compliance, scalability concerns. The technical details vary, but the architectural principles remain consistent." He paused as our coffee arrived. "Besides, what I value most isn't your knowledge of Horizon's specific systems, but your ability to see patterns and relationships within complex infrastructures. That's transferable to any technical environment." I sipped my coffee, considering his words. What exactly are you proposing? Chief Systems Architect position, reporting directly to me. Competitive salary plus equity in a company currently doubling in valuation annually. He named a figure that exceeded my Horizon compensation by nearly 30%. The offer was objectively excellent, a prestigious position in a growing company with significant financial upside. Yet something held me back from immediate acceptance. I'd need to understand more about your current systems and the specific challenges before committing, I said carefully. David nodded, respecting the professional caution. Of course. How about this? Once your knowledge transfer period at Horizon ends, take a week to decompress, then come in for detailed technical discussions with our team. No obligations on either side until you're confident it's the right fit. The proposal was reasonable and the opportunity promising. We spent the remainder of breakfast discussing MedPattern's growth trajectory and the technical challenges accompanying their rapid expansion. Throughout the conversation, I felt gratitude for David's recognition of my value, even as uncertainty lingered about whether simply transferring my expertise to another company, even one with better prospects, was the right next step. As we prepared to leave, David fixed me with a sincere look. Rebecca, Horizon's decision wasn't a reflection on your abilities. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes their technological infrastructure. You haven't become obsolete. Their thinking has. The validation helped, but as I drove to Horizon for my first day of knowledge transfer, confusion about my path forward remained. I had always defined myself through problems solved and systems maintained. Without that concrete framework, who was I professionally? Where did my value truly lie beyond the specific implementations I had created? I arrived at Horizon's offices with these questions still circulating. The security guard's surprise at seeing me, clearly not having been informed of my transitional status, was the first of many small humiliations that would characterize the knowledge transfer period. System says your access has been terminated, Ms. Chen, he explained apologetically. Check with Mr. Voss's office, I replied, maintaining professional composure. I'm here for the Neurosphere knowledge transfer. After several phone calls and visible confusion, a temporary access badge was issued with restricted permissions. The physical manifestation of my changed status, from trusted architect to potential security risk, was more affecting than I had anticipated. The development floor felt different as I entered, conversations pausing briefly as colleagues registered my presence with expressions ranging from sympathy to awkward avoidance. News of the restructuring had clearly been announced. Ethan approached. Immediately, relief visible on his features. Thank goodness you're here. They've set up the knowledge transfer room in Conference C. The Neurosphere engineers arrived an hour ago and have been asking questions I can't even understand, let alone answer. I nodded, unsurprised. Lead the way. Conference Room C had been transformed into a technical workspace, with multiple monitors displaying system diagrams and code repositories. 3 engineers from Neurosphere looked up as we entered, their expressions betraying a mixture of relief and wariness. The lead engineer, who introduced herself as Sanjana Kapoor, wasted no time on pleasantries. Ms. Chen, we've been attempting to map your authentication protocols to our standard implementation parameters, but we're encountering significant deviations from expected patterns. Yes, I acknowledged, setting down my bag and moving to the nearest monitor. That's because our authentication system was custom-built to accommodate the specific regulatory requirements of multi-state healthcare operations. It doesn't follow standard implementation patterns, because standard patterns don't address our particular constraints. The next several hours were consumed by increasingly technical discussions about system architecture, integration points, and the underlying logic of decisions made years earlier. I explained each element methodically, documenting the explicit aspects while knowing that the implicit connections, the why behind each architectural choice, would be far more difficult to transfer. By late afternoon, Sanjana's initial confidence had visibly diminished. "This is more complex than our preliminary assessment indicated," she admitted during a brief break. "The systems are deeply interconnected in ways that aren't immediately apparent from the documentation." "That's because documentation captures structure but not intuition," I replied, no satisfaction in the validation. "When you've built and evolved a system over 18 years, you develop an intuitive understanding of its behavior that goes beyond what can be explicitly recorded." She nodded slowly. "The AES system learns from patterns, but it requires those patterns to be consistent and identifiable. Your system seems to contain numerous exceptions and special cases that don't follow predictable logic." "They follow the logic of accumulated experience," I corrected. "Each exception exists for a specific reason: a particular client need, a regulatory requirement, a performance optimization. The patterns are there, but they require context to recognize." The conversation was interrupted by Michael Voss's arrival. He surveyed the room with forced optimism. "How's the knowledge transfer progressing?" Before I could respond, Sanjana spoke with professional candor. "We're identifying significant challenges in mapping the existing architecture to our standard implementation frameworks. The systems are more bespoke than we anticipated." Michael's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure you'll find solutions. Your system is designed to handle complex infrastructures, correct?" "Yes," Sanjana acknowledged. "But effective machine learning requires recognizable patterns. We may need to extend the knowledge transfer period to fully capture the system's operational logic." "That's not possible," Michael replied immediately. "The transition timeline is fixed based on financial quarter boundaries. The AES system needs to be operational by month end." I remained silent, observing the collision between technical reality and administrative dictates, a conflict I had navigated throughout my career, now unfolding without my mediation. The day ended with more questions than answers, both for the Neurosphere team attempting to understand Horizon's infrastructure, and for me attempting to understand my own path forward. As I gathered my notes, Ethan approached again. "Several of us are going for drinks after work," he said quietly. "The team would really appreciate if you could join." The invitation carried obvious emotional significance, an informal acknowledgement of my impending departure, and an opportunity for colleagues to express what corporate protocols might prevent within office walls. Despite my exhaustion, I accepted. The gathering at a nearby bar included most of my direct team and several developers from adjacent departments. The initial awkwardness quickly dissolved as conversation shifted from the day's technical challenges to shared memories of projects past, system deployments that had required all-night coding sessions, impossible client requests somehow satisfied. Through creative solutions, the camaraderie formed through collective problem-solving. "Remember when the hospital network implementation crashed during final testing?" reminisced Natalie, a senior developer who had worked alongside me for nearly a decade. "Rebecca stayed at the data center for 36 hours straight, troubleshooting, until she found that tiny permissions error in the backup verification module." Others contributed similar stories. Problems solved, disasters averted, innovations implemented. The narrative that emerged was not just of technical solutions, but of human determination, creativity, and responsibility. I had approached each challenge not as an isolated technical puzzle, but as a commitment to the healthcare providers and ultimately the patients who depended on our systems functioning flawlessly. As the evening progressed, the gathering's subtext became increasingly explicit. These weren't just reminiscences. They were testimonials to a form of value that couldn't be replicated by artificial intelligence, the human judgment that recognized when standard solutions were insufficient, when creative adaptation was necessary, when perfect was the enemy of good enough. "I don't understand how they expect this AI system to handle the unexpected," Ethan said finally. the alcohol lowering his professional guard. That's what you've always done best, Rebecca. Navigate the unpredictable. The observation struck a chord. Throughout my career, my greatest contributions hadn't been in implementing planned solutions, but in responding to unforeseen challenges. The architecture I had built wasn't valuable primarily for its planned functionality, but for its resilience, its capacity to adapt to changing requirements, unexpected inputs, and evolving regulatory landscapes. As I drove home later that evening, this insight continued to resonate. Perhaps my professional identity wasn't defined by the specific systems I had built, but by the approach I brought to complex problems. The ability to see patterns within chaos, to build structures that accommodated uncertainty, to balance technical elegance with practical necessity. If that were true, then my value wasn't tied to Horizon specifically, or even to the particular implementation details of the systems I had designed. It was more fundamental, a way of seeing and responding to complexity that could be applied. Across contexts, I arrived home to find an email from Sanjana, sent after hours and outside official channels. After today's sessions, I have concerns about our ability to fully capture the operational logic of your systems within the established timeline. Would you be open to discussing potential consulting arrangements beyond the knowledge transfer? Period. Unofficially, for now. The message confirmed what the day's interactions had suggested. The Neurosphere team was recognizing the limitations of their approach. The validation brought no satisfaction, only concern for the healthcare organizations that would ultimately bear the consequences of this transition. I didn't respond immediately, needing time to consider both the ethical and practical implications. Instead, I opened my laptop and began a different kind of documentation process. Not of Horizon systems, but of my own accumulated knowledge, approaches, and insights. If my professional value extended beyond specific implementations to a methodology, for handling complexity, perhaps that methodology could be articulated explicitly. For the next several hours, I mapped my own mental models, the frameworks I used for evaluating technical challenges, the principles that guided architectural decisions, the heuristics developed through years of problem-solving. The exercise wasn't intended for Horizon or Neurosphere, but for myself, a way of externalizing tacit knowledge that had operated largely at an intuitive level throughout my career. The resulting document revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized: consistent approaches to uncertainty, methods for balancing competing priorities, techniques for translating between technical possibilities and business requirements. These weren't specific to healthcare systems or even to software architecture. They were approaches to complexity itself. As midnight approached, fatigue finally overcame the intellectual momentum. I saved the document, giving it the file name Complexity Frameworks, an appropriately abstract title for what felt increasingly like a personal manifesto rather than technical documentation. Before shutting down my computer, I checked my personal email one last time. Among the messages was a notification from a professional networking site. Someone had viewed my profile. The viewer's identity was obscured in the free version of the service, but the timing suggested a connection to current events. I opened my profile, seeing it suddenly through potential employers' eyes. The description emphasized technical expertise in healthcare systems, regulatory compliance knowledge, and specific implementation details of enterprise architecture. What it failed to capture was the deeper value proposition revealed by the evening's reflection. Not just what I knew, but how I approached problems, particularly those that defied standard solutions. Impulsively, I began editing the profile, shifting emphasis from specific technical knowledge to problem-solving approaches. Architect of resilient systems that accommodate uncertainty and evolution, I wrote, the language feeling simultaneously presumptuous and precisely accurate. Specialist in navigating complexity where standard frameworks prove insufficient. By the time I finished, the profile described someone I recognized but had never consciously articulated, a professional identity defined not by specific implementations, but by an approach to complexity itself. Whether this articulation would resonate with potential employers remained uncertain, but it felt authentically aligned with my actual value. As I finally prepared for sleep, my phone chimed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. Ms. Chen, this is Sanjana Kapoor from Neurosphere. I apologize for the unorthodox communication, but after today's sessions, I've escalated concerns about the transition timeline to my management. Would it be possible to meet privately before tomorrow's knowledge transfer session? There are aspects of the implementation plan I need to discuss outside official channels. The message confirmed what had been increasingly evident throughout the day. The technical reality of Horizon's systems was colliding with administrative expectations in ways that created significant risk. My responsibility to ensure a smooth transition conflicted with growing certainty that the planned approach was fundamentally flawed. I responded briefly, agreeing to meet Sanjana early the next morning. Whatever her concerns, they represented an opportunity to advocate for a more realistic transition approach, even if my own position remained eliminated. As sleep finally claimed me, the question of identity remained unresolved, but somehow less threatening. The day's events had revealed that my professional value wasn't contained within Horizon systems or even within the specific domain of healthcare infrastructure. It existed in an approach to complexity that could potentially find application in numerous contexts, a realization both liberating and daunting as I contemplated an uncertain future. The morning arrived with unexpected clarity. Whatever came next, whether joining MedPatterns, considering Sanjana's implied consulting proposal, or pursuing an entirely different direction, would be shaped not by external validation but by alignment with the core value I offered, the ability to create order within complexity while maintaining resilience against uncertainty. This insight didn't eliminate the practical challenges ahead or the emotional weight of professional displacement, but it provided a foundation for moving forward, an identity independent of institutional affiliation or specific technical implementations. Not Rebecca Chen, Senior Systems Architect at Horizon Systems, but Rebecca Chen, Complexity Navigator. The title existed in no formal organizational chart, but it captured an essence that no artificial intelligence could readily replace. With this tentative self-definition, I prepared to meet Sanjana, uncertain of her specific concerns, but increasingly confident in my own professional worth, regardless of Horizon's institutional assessment. The early morning air carried a penetrating chill as I arrived at the small coffee shop Sanjana had suggested for our meeting. Located midway between my apartment and Horizon's offices, the venue offered both convenience and discretion, qualities that underscored the unofficial nature of our conversation. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that provided privacy while allowing me to observe the entrance. Sanjana arrived precisely on time, her typically composed professional demeanor showing subtle signs of strain, dark circles beneath her eyes, a slight disarray to her normally impeccable appearance. She spotted me immediately and approached. With purposeful strides, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling into the chair opposite mine. "I apologize for the unusual request." "No apology necessary," I replied. "I assume this concerns the AES implementation timeline?" She nodded, waiting until the server had delivered her coffee before continuing. "After yesterday's sessions, I conducted an initial compatibility analysis between your system architecture and our AES framework. The results were..." She paused, selecting her words carefully. "Significantly outside our standard implementation parameters." Meaning? Meaning that our initial 2-week knowledge transfer timeline is wildly unrealistic. Based on preliminary assessment, fully capturing the operational logic of your systems would require a minimum of 3 months, potentially 6. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've communicated this to my management, but they're reluctant to raise concerns with Horizon. The contract has specific performance timelines tied to substantial financial penalties. The situation clarified with depressing predictability. Neurosphere had overpromised capabilities during the sales process. Horizon had committed to unrealistic transition timelines to align with financial reporting periods, and now technical reality was colliding with administrative expectations. A scenario I had navigated countless times throughout my career, though never from my current powerless position. "What specifically concerns you about the current approach?" I asked, though I could anticipate the answer. Sanjana's response was blunt. "Catastrophic system failure. We're being expected to replace an organically evolved, highly customized infrastructure with an AI-driven framework in a time frame that doesn't allow for proper pattern recognition or anomaly identification. The AES system is powerful, but it requires sufficient learning data to establish operational baselines. Without that, it defaults to standard implementation patterns that are incompatible with your architecture." Her assessment aligned with my own, but hearing it articulated by the very engineer tasked with implementing the AI system provided unsettling validation. "Have you expressed these specific concerns to Michael Voss?" "I've tried," she admitted, frustration evident. "But he keeps redirecting technical questions to administrative paths. Submit a formal implementation variance request. Escalate through proper channels. Meanwhile, the timeline remains unchanged, and our team is being pressured to sign off on transition readiness by next week." I considered the implications carefully. The system architecture I had built over 18 years supported critical healthcare operations for hundreds of organizations. Patients' treatment decisions, billing processes, and regulatory compliance all depended on its reliable functioning. A catastrophic failure wouldn't just impact Horizon's financial performance, it could potentially affect clinical outcomes. "What are you asking of me exactly?" I inquired, though her unspoken request was increasingly clear. Sanjana met my gaze directly. "Officially, nothing has changed. The knowledge transfer continues as planned. Unofficially, I'm proposing a parallel track. You working directly with me to create a comprehensive system map that identifies critical failure points and essential operational logic. This wouldn't prevent the transition, but it would create a safety framework for when problems inevitably arise." "And what would motivate me to provide this additional assistance beyond my contractual obligations?" I asked, not from mercenary consideration, but to understand her complete proposal. "A consulting contract directly with Neurosphere," she replied without hesitation. "Independent of Horizon, activated immediately after your official knowledge transfer concludes. My management has authorized me to offer this, though they don't fully understand why it's necessary." The proposal presented a complex ethical and professional calculation. On one hand, continuing involvement with Horizon Systems would delay my psychological separation from an organization that had dismissed my value. On the other, my responsibility to the healthcare providers and ultimately the patients served by these systems transcended corporate boundaries. The infrastructure I had built wasn't merely code and databases, it was a critical component of healthcare delivery for millions of people. "I need time to consider this," I told her finally, "and I'd need to review any consulting agreement carefully before committing." She nodded, relief visible in her features. "That's fair. We can discuss specific terms later this week. For now, your awareness of our concerns is sufficient." As we prepared to leave for Horizon's offices, separately to maintain the appearance of coincidental timing, Sanjana paused. "For what it's worth, Ms. Chen, what you've built is remarkable. Our technical team has implemented AES across dozens of enterprise environments, and none have exhibited the architectural elegance and adaptive resilience of your systems. Whatever Horizon's management believes about AI replacing human expertise, the reality is far more nuanced." Her validation, registered not as personal affirmation but as professional acknowledgement. One technical specialist recognizing another's work. The systems evolved through necessity, I replied. Elegance was always secondary to functionality. That's precisely what makes them remarkable, she countered. They evolved rather than being constructed according to rigid blueprints. That organic quality makes them simultaneously more resilient and more challenging to replicate through algorithmic means. We parted with the understanding that our official interactions would continue unchanged, the parallel conversation remaining confidential. As I drove to Horizon, I considered Sanjana's proposal within the broader context of my uncertain professional future. The consulting opportunity offered financial stability and continued engagement with systems I understood intimately. Yet, it also represented a half measure, remaining connected to Horizon without the authority or recognition previously afforded. The security desk at Horizon presented the same temporary access badge ritual as the previous day, though the guard's discomfort had diminished through repetition. The knowledge transfer room showed signs of intensive activity, whiteboards covered, with system diagrams, monitors displaying code repositories, empty coffee cups suggesting late-night analysis. For the next 8 hours, I continued methodically documenting the explicit aspects of Horizon's infrastructure, while recognizing the impossibility of capturing its implicit logic within the established timeline. The neurosphere engineer's questions became increasingly specific and technical, revealing growing awareness of the system's complexity. Ethan participated actively, his understanding of certain subsystems impressive given his limited tenure, though his questions often exposed critical gaps in contextual knowledge. Throughout the day, I maintained professional composure, answering questions thoroughly, creating documentation that future administrators might actually use, fulfilling my contractual obligations with integrity despite the institutional devaluation of my contributions. Yet beneath this performance, my mind continuously processed Sanjana's concerns, David Zhang's opportunity, and my own evolving understanding of professional identity, independent of organizational affiliation. By late afternoon, mental fatigue had set in for the entire room. Michael Voss made another appearance, his forced optimism now tinged with visible concern, as he observed the whiteboards covered with complex system diagrams. "Progress report?" he inquired, the question directed at Sanjana rather than me. "We're making headway," she replied diplomatically. "The documentation is extremely helpful, though we're identifying additional integration points that weren't captured in the preliminary assessment." Michael's expression tightened slightly. "But you're still on track for the established timeline?" The question contained its own answer. Deviation from the predetermined schedule was not an acceptable response. Sanjana maintained professional poise. "We're proceeding according to plan. Some technical challenges have emerged, but that's expected in transitions of this complexity." The exchange exemplified what had always frustrated me about conversations between technical specialists and administrative management, the necessity of translating objective reality into politically acceptable language that ultimately obscured rather than clarified critical issues. Throughout my career, I had served as interpreter between these domains, finding ways to communicate technical truths without triggering administrative defensiveness. Now I observed the dynamic as an outsider, recognizing both its familiarity and its fundamental dysfunction. After Michael departed, work continued for another hour before the team dispersed for the day. As I gathered my notes, Ethan approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Rebecca, could I ask you something unofficial?" His careful phrasing suggested a question beyond standard knowledge transfer. "Of course. Do you think this is actually going to work? The AES implementation, I mean." His voice dropped to near whisper despite the empty room. "Some of these systems are so specific to our clients and regulatory requirements. I don't see how an AI framework can adapt quickly enough to maintain operational integrity." The question placed me in a difficult position, balancing honesty with professional responsibility, Mentors' guidance with organizational loyalty. AI systems are powerful tools for recognizing patterns and optimizing known processes, I began carefully. But they struggle with contextual judgment, understanding why certain exceptions exist and when standard approaches should be modified to accommodate unique circumstances. Ethan nodded, processing this diplomatic response. So, in your professional opinion? In my professional opinion, I continued, choosing words with precision, successful implementation will require realistic expectations, extended timeline allowances, and significant human oversight during the transition period. None of which are currently in place, he observed quietly. That's a management assessment I'm not positioned to make, I replied, maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging the subtext of his concern. Ethan's expression revealed the bind he found himself in, newly promoted to a position beyond his experience, responsible for a transition he increasingly doubted, unable to voice concerns without potentially undermining his precarious professional standing. I'm wondering if I should be updating my resume, he admitted finally. The candid vulnerability reminded me of my mentorship responsibilities, which existed independent of organizational structures. Technical expertise remains valuable regardless of current trends, I told him. The ability to understand complex systems and translate between technical and business domains is persistently in demand, even as specific implementation approaches evolve. That's what you've always done best, he observed. Not just building systems, but making them intelligible to non-technical stakeholders. The observation aligned with my recent reflections on professional identity. That translation function becomes even more essential as AI implementation increases, I noted. Algorithms can process data patterns, but they can't inherently explain their operations in terms humans understand or trust. Human interpreters with both technical understanding and communication skills bridge that gap. Our conversation continued briefly, touching on potential career development paths that might leverage Ethan's technical capabilities within the evolving landscape. Though I couldn't directly advise him to seek other opportunities, I provided perspectives that might inform his independent assessment of the situation. As I left Horizon's offices that evening, I found myself mentally exhausted yet intellectually stimulated. The day's technical discussions and interpersonal dynamics, having activated both my systems architecture expertise and my emerging understanding of my broader professional value. Rather than returning directly home, I drove to a lakeside park I had often visited during rare breaks throughout my career. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water as I found a secluded bench overlooking the shoreline. The physical distance from both Horizon and my apartment created space for reflection uncontaminated by either professional or personal contexts. I opened my notebook, not the technical documentation from the knowledge transfer sessions, but a personal journal rarely used in recent years. On a fresh page, I created 3 columns: known, unknown, and possibilities. Under known, I listed objective facts about my current situation. 18 years of systems architecture experience, 2 weeks remaining in the knowledge transfer process. Financial security through severance package and savings. Strong professional network, including former colleagues in leadership positions. Specific offers from both David Jang and potentially Neurosphere. The unknown column captured uncertainties. Long-term market value of my expertise as AI implementation expanded. Timeline for Horizon systems to experience critical failures. Post-transition. Whether staying connected to those systems through consulting served my best interests. What alternative applications of my capabilities might exist beyond traditional systems architecture roles? In possibilities, I allowed myself to consider options beyond the immediate choices presented. Creating an independent consultancy focused on complex systems integration. Writing a book, or developing courses on resilient systems architecture. Partnering with healthcare startups to create next-generation infrastructure. that combined human judgment with AI capabilities, taking a sabbatical to explore adjacent fields where systems thinking applied to different domains. As darkness settled over the lake, patterns emerged from this structured reflection. The most promising directions involved leveraging my capabilities as a complexity navigator rather than merely a systems implementer, focusing on the translation function between technical possibilities and human needs that had always been my strongest contribution. Moreover, the current situation at Horizon represented not just a personal career disruption, but a case study in the broader integration challenges organizations faced when implementing AI solutions. My experience could potentially serve others, navigating similar transitions, not by resisting technological evolution, but by creating more effective integration approaches that recognize the complementary strengths of human judgment and algorithmic processing. With this perspective taking shape, I closed my notebook and returned home, the evening's reflection having transformed vague uncertainty into the beginning of strategic direction. While specific next steps remained unclear, the foundational question had shifted from, "What position should I pursue?" to, "How might my capabilities best address meaningful challenges at the intersection of human judgment and technological evolution?" This reframing proved immediately useful as I reviewed the three specific opportunities currently before me: David Zhang's offer at MedPatterns, Sanjana's potential consulting arrangement with Neurosphere, and the possibility of independent work. Each could be evaluated not merely for financial compensation or professional status, but for alignment with this emerging sense of purpose. After a light dinner, I opened my laptop to research how other organizations were handling AI integration within complex systems environments. The results revealed a pattern. Beneath the optimistic press releases and vendor claims lay numerous examples of implementation challenges, unexpected system failures, and costly adjustments, as organizations discovered the limitations of purely algorithmic approaches to contextual decision-making. One article particularly resonated: a case study of a financial services firm that had implemented an AI-driven risk assessment system only to discover critical blind spots in its evaluation methodology. The solution had ultimately involved creating a hybrid approach where human analysts provided contextual judgment that complemented the AI's pattern recognition capabilities. The resulting system outperformed both pure human analysis and pure algorithmic processing, suggesting the optimal path forward wasn't replacement but integration. This alignment with my emerging thinking provided welcome validation. While Horizon's management had framed the situation as binary, either human expertise or AI processing, the most effective approaches appeared to involve thoughtful integration that leveraged the complementary strengths of each. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a message notification. The sender was Natalie, one of the senior developers from my team at Horizon. Massive synchronization failure in the test environment implementation today. Neurosphere engineers struggling to identify root cause. Management minimizing, but dev team concerned about implications for production transition. Thought you should know. The message wasn't surprising given Sanjana's earlier concerns, but the rapidity with which issues were emerging exceeded even my pessimistic expectations. The test environment contained only a fraction of the complexity present in production systems, using simplified data structures and controlled inputs. If synchronization failures were already occurring at this stage, the production transition faced significantly greater risks. I responded with appropriate professional concern while avoiding overt criticism of the implementation approach. Thanks for letting me know. Test environment failures provide valuable learning opportunities before production deployment. If the IT team identifies specific questions I might help with, I'm available within the knowledge transfer parameters. This measured response maintained professional boundaries while offering limited assistance. Though tempted to request additional details about the specific nature of the synchronization failure, information that might help assess the broader implications for system stability, I resisted. My current role was limited to knowledge transfer of existing systems, not troubleshooting the new implementation. Expanding beyond those parameters would blur already complex professional boundaries. As I finally settled into sleep, the day's events had crystallized something important. The value I offered wasn't diminished by Horizon's decision or by advancing AI capabilities. Rather, it was potentially enhanced by the increasing need for human judgment at the intersection of complex systems and algorithmic processing. This recognition didn't eliminate the practical and emotional challenges of professional transition, but it provided conceptual foundation for navigating them with purpose rather than merely reacting to circumstances. The knowledge transfer would continue for another 9 workdays, each likely bringing additional evidence of implementation challenges. Beyond that artificial horizon lay decisions about next professional steps, each with distinct implications for both practical circumstances and evolving professional identity. Yet the question no longer centered on which specific position to pursue, but on how to leverage my capabilities toward meaningful contribution in a technological landscape undergoing fundamental transformation. This perspective shift represented the beginning of agency reclamation, moving from passive recipient of organizational decisions to active architect of a professional identity that transcended specific institutional roles. Whatever specific path emerged, it would be shaped by deliberate choice rather than merely inherited circumstances. The next morning arrived with renewed purpose. The knowledge transfer sessions would continue as professionally executed fulfillment of contractual obligations. But parallel to this visible process, a more significant transition was unfolding, not the replacement of my systems architecture role, but the evolution of my understanding of what that role had always fundamentally been, creating interfaces between technical complexity and human needs. That function remained essential regardless of which specific technologies executed the resulting designs. With this clarity, I prepared for another day of documentation and explanation, my professional identity no longer tethered to Horizon's institutional assessment, but anchored in a deeper understanding of my persistent value in an evolving technological landscape. By the 4th day of knowledge transfer, a troubling pattern had emerged. Each morning began with a confidential update from a current Horizon employee, Ethan, Natalie, or another team member, detailing new implementation challenges encountered by the Neurosphere engineers. Each day's official sessions then proceeded, without acknowledgement of these growing concerns, creating a surreal disconnect between observable reality and institutional narrative. Today's message had come from Ethan. Authentication module failed catastrophically during overnight testing. 3 Neurosphere engineers still here from yesterday trying to rebuild configuration settings. Management calling it expected integration. Adjustments. I arrived at Horizon to find the knowledge transfer room's atmosphere noticeably tense. Sanjana and 2 colleagues huddled around a monitor displaying authentication logs, their expressions reflecting the stress of prolonged troubleshooting. When she noticed my arrival, Sanjana straightened with visible relief. "Ms. Chen, good morning. We have some questions about the authentication module's handling of multi-factor verification across different client security domains." The carefully neutral phrasing masked what appeared to be a significant implementation crisis. I set down my bag and moved to join their huddle, slipping seamlessly into the problem-solving mode that had defined much of my career. "Let me see what you're working with," I said, scanning the error logs displayed on the monitor. The patterns were immediately recognizable, a cascading authentication failure triggered by misalignment between security domain parameters and verification protocols. This was precisely the type of complex interdependency that resisted straightforward documentation and required contextual understanding to navigate. "You're trying to implement the standard verification sequence," I observed. "But this system uses a modified protocol I developed for clients with multi-state operations. It prioritizes regulatory compliance parameters over standard security handshakes." For the next 2 hours, I guided the Neurosphere team through the underlying architecture of the authentication system, explaining not just how it functioned, but why it had been designed with these specific modifications. The session evolved beyond simple knowledge transfer into collaborative problem-solving, with the engineers asking increasingly sophisticated questions as their understanding deepened. "This is brilliantly designed," one of the younger engineers remarked, genuine admiration in his voice. "The way you've nested compliance verification within the authentication sequence rather than treating them as separate processes, it's elegant and efficient." "Necessity drove the design," I explained. "When regulatory requirements changed 5 years ago, we needed a solution that maintained backward compatibility while accommodating new compliance standards. This approach emerged from those constraints." The engineer nodded thoughtfully. "That contextual adaptation is precisely what our standard implementations struggle to capture. We optimize for known patterns rather than evolutionary response to changing requirements." By mid-morning, the team had identified the specific configuration issues causing the authentication failures. As they implemented corrections, I found myself unwittingly drawn back into systems thinking, not just explaining existing architecture, but considering how these same capabilities might be preserved within the new implementation approach. "Your modified protocol could actually enhance our standard authentication framework," Sanjana observed during a brief break. "It addresses several limitations we've encountered in other healthcare implementations." Her comment triggered an unexpected realization. While Horizon's management viewed my system's knowledge as a transitional necessity to be extracted and then discarded, the engineers implementing the replacement recognized its ongoing value. The distinction wasn't between human expertise and AI processing, but between different frameworks for valuing knowledge: transactional versus developmental, extractive versus collaborative. This insight resonated with my emerging understanding of professional identity. My value wasn't contained within static knowledge that could be documented and transferred, but in the dynamic capacity to recognize patterns, adapt to changing conditions, and continuously evolve solutions. This capability remained relevant, regardless of which specific technologies executed the resulting designs. The morning's problem-solving session had reminded me of something essential. I genuinely enjoyed the intellectual challenge of complex systems work. Beyond professional identity or financial compensation, there was intrinsic satisfaction in navigating complexity, identifying underlying patterns, and developing solutions that balanced competing requirements. This core enjoyment had sometimes been obscured by institutional politics and administrative constraints, but it remained a fundamental motivator that would inform whatever came next. As the knowledge transfer session proceeded throughout the day, I found myself unconsciously shifting approach, moving beyond passive documentation of existing systems toward active consideration of how these same capabilities might be implemented within different technological frameworks. This wasn't merely fulfilling contractual obligations, it was engaging creatively with the translation challenge between established systems and emerging technologies. This subtle shift didn't escape Sanjana's notice. During an afternoon break, she approached as I reviewed system diagrams at a side table. "You're thinking about how these systems could be reimagined, aren't you?" she observed. "Not just documenting what exists, but considering how it could evolve." Her perception was accurate. "Force of habit," I acknowledged. 18 years of continuous adaptation creates certain thought patterns. "That's precisely what algorithms can't replicate," she responded. "They optimize existing patterns but can't conceptualize fundamental reimagining." She hesitated before continuing. "Have you considered our consulting proposal? My management has authorized me to formalize the offer." The question required thoughtful consideration. The consulting role would provide financial stability and continued engagement with systems I understood intimately. Yet it also represented potential entrapment, remaining connected to Horizon without the authority or recognition previously afforded. potentially delaying necessary professional evolution. I'm still evaluating options, I replied. There are several possibilities under consideration. Sanjana nodded, understanding the subtext. Of course. But if you're interested, we could discuss specific parameters later this week. As the day's session concluded, Michael Voss made his now daily appearance, clearly seeking reassurance about the transition timeline. His questions to Sanjana carried increasing urgency, suggesting growing awareness of implementation challenges despite official minimization. The overnight testing issues, they've been resolved? He asked, attempting casual inquiry but betraying underlying concern. We've identified the authentication module configuration parameters requiring adjustment, Sanjana replied with professional precision. Implementation is proceeding according to established protocols. The carefully constructed response acknowledged reality while avoiding direct confirmation of timeline feasibility. Michael seemed momentarily satisfied, though his glance toward the complex system diagrams covering the whiteboards betrayed lingering doubt. As I prepared to leave, Ethan approached with uncharacteristic determination. A few of us are meeting, off-site to discuss current developments, he said quietly. Your perspective would be valuable if you're available. The invitation clearly extended beyond professional courtesy to active collaboration, though potentially crossing institutional boundaries. It represented an opportunity to support former colleagues navigating a challenging transition. Text me the details, I responded simply. The meeting location proved to be a private room at a restaurant well removed from Horizon's offices. In addition to Ethan, the gathering included Natalie, 2 senior developers from adjacent teams, and surprisingly, Carlos Martinez, the database administrator who had joined Horizon shortly after me, and who had always maintained careful political neutrality throughout organizational changes. Thank you for coming, Carlos began once preliminary greetings concluded. We're facing a situation that requires seasoned perspective. The subsequent discussion revealed implementation challenges far exceeding what had been officially acknowledged. Authentication failures represented merely the visible surface of deeper architectural conflicts. Testing environments were experiencing unpredictable data synchronization issues. Client-specific customizations were proving resistant to standard implementation approaches, and the Neurosphere engineers were increasingly raising timeline concerns that management consistently dismissed. They're accelerating the production transition despite all evidence suggesting we're nowhere near ready, Natalie explained, frustration evident. The revised plan has us moving to the AES system for all non-critical processing next week, with full implementation, including client-facing systems, the following week. That timeline isn't technically feasible, I observed, the assessment based on objective evaluation rather than personal vindication. We know, Ethan agreed. The Neurosphere team knows. Even Michael probably knows, though he won't acknowledge it officially. But Vivian is committed to announcing the successful AI transition to shareholders at the quarterly meeting. The technical reality is secondary to the market narrative. The scenario was depressingly familiar, a pattern repeated throughout my career, though never with such potentially severe consequences. Critical healthcare systems supporting hundreds of organizations faced significant disruption based on administrative priorities, disconnected from technical feasibility. What are you considering? I asked, sensing an unspoken proposal beneath the situation description. The group exchanged glances before Carlos continued. We're documenting everything: implementation issues, management responses, timeline modifications. Not for immediate disclosure, but as protection when systems inevitably fail. But documentation isn't enough. We need contingency planning. Meaning? Meaning we need recovery protocols for when, not if, critical systems experience catastrophic failure. Procedures for restoring functionality, protecting client data, maintaining regulatory compliance during disruption. He met my gaze directly. protocols only you fully understand. The request presented complex ethical considerations. Creating recovery protocols would involve work beyond my knowledge transfer obligations, potentially enabling a flawed transition approach while providing essential protection for healthcare organizations dependent on these systems. Officially, I'm limited to the established knowledge transfer parameters, I reminded them, maintaining professional boundaries. Officially, yes, Carlos acknowledged. Unofficially, we're asking for guidance in developing contingency measures, not implementation assistance for Neurosphere, but protection for the healthcare providers and ultimately the patients who depend on these systems functioning correctly. The appeal to broader responsibility resonated. Throughout my career, I had approached systems architecture not merely as technical implementation, but as essential infrastructure supporting healthcare delivery. That responsibility transcended corporate boundaries and current employment status. I can provide general guidance on recovery approaches, I conceded carefully. Not directly implementing solutions, but outlining architectural principles for maintaining critical functionality during system disruption. The relief was visible across the table. For the next 2 hours, we engaged in detailed discussion of potential failure scenarios and corresponding recovery approaches. The conversation was simultaneously troubling and intellectually stimulating. Troubling in its confirmation of implementation risks, stimulating in its return to complex problem-solving with capable colleagues. Throughout this discussion, I found myself unconsciously shifting perspective, approaching the situation not as Horizon's former systems architect, but as an independent expert in complex systems recovery. This subtle reframing felt significant, suggesting professional identity evolving beyond specific organizational affiliation toward broader domain expertise. As the meeting concluded, Carlos expressed what appeared to be collective sentiment. Your approaches to these systems always prioritized resilience over rigid efficiency, he observed. We didn't fully appreciate the value of that perspective until now, facing a transition that prioritizes standardization over adaptability. The validation was meaningful, not for personal vindication, but as recognition of architectural principles I had consistently championed. Resilience, adaptability, and contextual awareness weren't merely personal preferences, but essential qualities for systems supporting critical human needs, qualities increasingly important as implementation approaches evolved toward algorithmic standardization. I drove home with renewed clarity about professional direction. Whatever specific role emerged next, it would involve bridging between standardized technological approaches and the messy contextual reality of human systems. This translation function, helping organizations implement emerging technologies while maintaining essential resilience, represented both genuine market need and authentic personal capability. Upon reaching home, I found an email from David Zhang awaiting response. A gentle inquiry about my interest in the MedPatterns position following the knowledge transfer period. The opportunity remained appealing, offering immediate professional continuity and association with a growing organization whose values appeared to align with my own. Yet something gave me pause. The MedPatterns role, while prestigious and well-compensated, represented essentially lateral movement, applying the same expertise in a different organizational context. While this offered certain security, it potentially limited exploration of emerging professional directions suggested by recent insights. I drafted a response expressing continued interest while requesting additional conversation following the knowledge transfer period. This maintained the opportunity while creating space for fuller consideration of alternatives, including Sanjana's consulting proposal and potential independent work. As evening progressed, I found myself drawn to my laptop, not for employment research but for technical exploration. For the first time in years, I began coding without organizational directive or specific implementation purpose, creating a simulation model that explored integration approaches between traditional systems, architecture, and machine learning frameworks. The activity wasn't directly connected to immediate employment questions, but represented reconnection with the intellectual curiosity that had originally drawn me to systems work. Without institutional constraints or implementation deadlines, I found myself exploring questions of systems design purely for the satisfaction of navigating complex conceptual territory. Hours passed unnoticed as the model evolved, incorporating elements from both traditional architecture and emerging AI approaches. The resulting hybrid framework wasn't perfect. Certain integration points remained conceptually challenging. Specific implementation details would require further development. But it represented a potential bridge between established systems, thinking and algorithmic processing that preserved essential resilience while leveraging computational capabilities. When I finally paused well past midnight, I realized something significant had shifted. For the first time since the termination meeting, I had spent hours fully engaged in technological exploration, without reference to employment status or institutional validation. The work itself, navigating complexity, identifying patterns, developing integrative solutions, provided intrinsic satisfaction independent of organizational context. This reconnection with fundamental motivation felt significant. Whatever emerged next professionally would need to maintain this connection to core curiosity and problem-solving satisfaction. This wasn't merely about financial compensation or professional status, but about creating conditions for meaningful engagement with work that leveraged authentic capabilities. The following morning brought unexpected development. Upon arriving at Horizon for the day's knowledge transfer session, I found Sanjana waiting anxiously near the security desk, her expression suggesting significant concerns. The client validation module failed catastrophically during overnight processing, she explained once we had moved to a private area. Test data corrupted across multiple domains. The Neurosphere team has been working since midnight without resolution. The situation clearly exceeded normal implementation challenges, potentially affecting data integrity across interconnected systems. Has the failure been isolated? I asked, immediately considering containment priorities. Partially, but the corruption appears to have cascaded into secondary validation processes before containment protocols activated. Her professional composure momentarily slipped. Ms. Chen, this is beyond standard implementation issues. We're facing fundamental architectural conflicts that can't be resolved through configuration adjustments. The assessment aligned with my private expectations, but exceeded what had been officially acknowledged until now. Have you communicated this to Michael Voss? I've tried. He insists that we document the specific technical issues and submit them through formal channels, but maintains that the implementation timeline remains unchanged. Her frustration was evident. There's growing disconnect between technical reality and management directives. Before I could respond, Michael himself appeared near the security desk, his expression shifting from surprise to careful neutrality upon seeing our conversation. He approached with forced casualness. Rebecca, Sanjana, good morning. I was just coming to check on progress with the knowledge transfer. Sanjana met his inquiry directly. We've encountered significant data integrity issues during overnight testing. The client validation module experienced cascading failures that corrupted test data across multiple domains. Michael's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. These adjustment issues are expected during complex implementations. I'm sure your team will identify the specific configuration parameters requiring modification. This isn't a configuration issue, Sanjana countered with professional firmness. We're encountering fundamental architectural conflicts between the AES framework and the existing system design. These can't be resolved through standard implementation approaches within the established timeline. The direct challenge to official narrative created momentary tension. Michael glanced between us before responding with careful diplomacy. Let's continue this discussion in my office. Technical details are better addressed in appropriate settings. As we followed him through the security protocols and toward the executive area, I considered my role in this emerging confrontation. Though no longer officially responsible for Horizon Systems, I retained both knowledge of their architecture and ethical concern for their proper functioning. Finding appropriate balance between these considerations while respecting current organizational boundaries required careful navigation. Michael's office presented the same panoramic views that had framed my termination meeting, the city skyline now illuminated by morning sunlight. He closed the door and turned to face us, administrative authority reasserted within this formal setting. "Now, what specifically are we dealing with?" he asked, directing the question primarily to Sanjana. She outlined the technical issues, with precision, emphasizing the data integrity impacts and cascading failure patterns. These aren't isolated implementation challenges, but indications of fundamental architectural conflicts. The AES system approaches data validation sequentially, while the existing architecture employs parallel validation with conditional dependencies. These approaches can't be reconciled through configuration adjustments. Michael listened with growing concern, his expression suggesting dawning recognition that the implementation challenges exceeded standard transition issues. When Sanjana concluded, he turned to me. "Rebecca, you've been observing the knowledge transfer process. What's your assessment of these concerns?" The question presented both opportunity and challenge, chance to advocate for realistic technical assessment while avoiding appearance of undermining the transition for personal vindication. I chose my response carefully. "The issues Sanjana describes are consistent with the architectural approach I implemented for client validation processes. Those systems were designed specifically to accommodate healthcare regulatory requirements across multiple jurisdictions, using parallel validation with conditional dependencies to maintain both performance and compliance. Standard sequential. Validation would indeed create significant conflicts with that architecture. Michael processed this information, institutional imperatives visibly competing with technical reality in his consideration. "What would you recommend?" he asked finally, the question acknowledging expertise despite official dismissal. "An extended transition timeline with phased implementation," I replied without hesitation. "Begin with non-critical processing systems where architectural conflicts present lower risk, establish stability there, then gradually incorporate more complex components, with appropriate testing between phases. Rushing full implementation without resolving these fundamental conflicts guarantees significant system failures affecting client operations." The recommendation clearly conflicted with established administrative commitments, particularly the quarterly shareholder announcement. Michael's expression reflected this tension as he considered responses. "I appreciate the technical perspective," he said finally. "I'll discuss timeline considerations with Vivian, though I should note that significant commitments have been made based on the original implementation schedule." "Financial commitments can be renegotiated," Sanjana observed with professional directness. "Data integrity failures affecting healthcare operations create liabilities that can't be similarly resolved." The implicit warning landed effectively. Michael's expression suggested recognition that the situation had evolved beyond standard implementation challenges into potential organizational risk territory. "I'll arrange a meeting with Vivian this morning," he conceded. "In the meantime, please document the specific technical conflicts in detail for executive review." As we left his office, Sanjana's relief was evident. "Thank you for the technical validation," she said once we were alone. "My concerns weren't gaining traction without corroboration from someone with your system knowledge." "The architecture speaks for itself," I replied. "The validation issues simply make visible what was always going to emerge during implementation." We proceeded to the knowledge transfer room, where the Neurosphere team continued troubleshooting the overnight failures. The atmosphere combined technical focus with underlying anxiety. engineers recognizing fundamental challenges while constrained by organizational expectations and contractual commitments. For the remainder of the morning, I provided guidance on containment approaches for the data corruption issues, focusing on protecting client information while restoring validation functionality. The process involved detailed technical collaboration, engineers from both organizations working to stabilize systems without reference to institutional boundaries or implementation politics. This collaborative problem-solving felt simultaneously familiar and novel. Familiar in its technical focus, novel in my position outside organizational hierarchy. Contributing expertise without organizational authority created different collaborative dynamics, relationships based on demonstrated knowledge rather than positional power. By early afternoon, the immediate validation issues had been contained, though fundamental architectural conflicts remained unresolved. As the team paused for a late lunch, Ethan approached with an update from the executive level. Vivian has called an emergency meeting with the senior leadership team, he reported. Quietly, Michael presented the implementation concerns, apparently with significant emphasis on potential client impacts. The quarterly announcement is being reconsidered. The information suggested potential shift in organizational approach, acknowledging technical reality rather than maintaining artificial timelines. Whether this represented temporary adjustment or fundamental reconsideration remained unclear. As the afternoon progressed, I continued knowledge transfer activities while monitoring the stabilization efforts for the validation systems. Around 4:30 p.m., Michael appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Rebecca, could I speak with you privately?" I followed him to a small conference room adjacent to the knowledge transfer area. He closed the door before speaking. "We've been discussing the implementation timeline with Vivian and the Neurosphere leadership team. Given the technical challenges encountered, we're considering modifications to the transition approach." He paused, seeming to select words carefully. "Your recommendation for phased implementation with extended timeline has been raised as a potential alternative." The statement stopped short of directly requesting my input, but clearly opened the door for response. A phased approach would significantly reduce implementation risks while allowing for architectural adaptation between each stage, I noted. Michael nodded slowly. "There are financial implications to timeline extension, both for Horizon and Neurosphere. Contract modifications would be required." Another pause. "Vivian has asked whether you would be willing to join a planning meeting tomorrow morning to discuss revised implementation approaches, not as a Horizon employee, but as an independent consultant with relevant expertise." The request represented significant shift, from dismissed employee to recognized expert, from extraction target to potential collaborator. The change carried both professional validation and complex considerations about appropriate boundaries and future direction. "I'd be open to participating in such a discussion," I replied carefully. "With appropriate consulting parameters established." Relief crossed Michael's features. "Excellent. The meeting is scheduled for 9:01 a.m. I'll have the necessary consulting agreement prepared beforehand." As he left, I considered the implications of this development. The situation had evolved from unilateral dismissal to recognition of ongoing value, suggesting potential for more substantive professional recalibration. Whether this represented merely tactical adjustment or genuine reassessment of expertise, valuation remained to be seen. What felt certain was that reconnection with my fundamental capabilities, navigating complexity, translating between technical and administrative domains, designing resilient systems, had occurred independent of organizational validation. That reconnection would inform whatever emerged next, whether at Horizon, MedPatterns, Neurosphere, or elsewhere. The work itself, complex problem-solving at the intersection of technical systems and human needs, remained intrinsically meaningful regardless of institutional context. With this clarity, I prepared for tomorrow's discussion not as supply applicant seeking reinstatement, but as independent expert offering unique value. Whatever Horizon now recognized about my capabilities had always been true. The only change was in institutional perception rather than fundamental worth. The consulting agreement arrived in my email at 7:15 a.m., a standard independent contractor arrangement specifying an hourly rate significantly higher than my former salary, with terms limited to implementation consultation rather than ongoing system support. The document had been prepared with surprising thoroughness given the late-night request, suggesting either exceptional administrative efficiency or prior consideration of this contingency. I reviewed the terms carefully before signing, particularly provisions regarding intellectual property and future obligations. The agreement positioned me as an independent expert providing temporary guidance rather than an integrated team member, a distinction that aligned with my evolving professional self-perception. After electronic signature, I forwarded the completed document and prepared for the day's meeting with a sense of cautious anticipation. Arriving at Horizon's offices, I found the security protocols noticeably modified. Instead of the temporary badge and escort requirements of recent days, I received a consultant access credential that permitted independent movement throughout the building. This small administrative adjustment reflected significant status shift from former employee requiring containment to recognized expert, granted professional autonomy. The meeting was scheduled in Horizon's main conference room, a space typically reserved for client presentations and board gatherings rather than internal discussions. As I approached, I noticed an unexpected figure through the glass walls, Dr. Eleanor Winters, founder and former CEO of Horizon Systems, who had retired 3 years earlier after transitioning leadership to her selected executive team. Her presence at an implementation discussion was surprising, given her public withdrawal from operational involvement following retirement. I entered to find the conference table already surrounded by key stakeholders. Vivian Chen at the head position, Michael Voss beside her, Sanjana and 2 senior Neurosphere executives opposite them. Dr. Winters sat slightly apart, her position suggesting observer status rather than direct participation. All conversation paused as I entered, with expressions ranging from Vivian's careful neutrality to Sanjana's visible relief. "Rebecca, thank you for joining us," Vivian began, gesturing to an open seat. "We've been discussing implementation challenges with the AES system and potential adjustments to the transition approach." I nodded professionally, taking the indicated seat and opening my laptop. "I've reviewed the consulting agreement and submitted the signed document." "Excellent," Vivian replied. "For clarity regarding your role here, we're seeking independent technical assessment of implementation options, not reconsideration of the overall transition direction. The AI implementation will proceed, but we recognize potential benefits in timeline and approach modifications." The parameters were clearly established. My expertise was now valued, but within specific boundaries that maintained administrative commitment to the original decision. I accepted these constraints without comment, focusing on the technical discussion at hand. The meeting proceeded with detailed examination of implementation challenges, particularly the architectural conflicts between the AES system's standardized approach and Horizon's highly customized infrastructure. The Neurosphere executives presented modified implementation options, most involving extended timelines with phased transition approaches similar to what I had suggested to Michael. Throughout this discussion, I provided technical assessment when directly addressed, but otherwise maintained observer status, analytically noting the evolving power dynamics as technical reality gradually realigned organizational priorities. Dr. Winters remained similarly reserved, her occasional questions precisely targeted to expose gaps between administrative assumptions and implementation requirements. After nearly an hour of increasingly circular discussion, Vivian turned directly to me. "Rebecca, you designed these systems and have been observing the knowledge transfer process. What specific implementation approach would you recommend at this point?" The question created an inflection point, opportunity to shape technical direction despite my official separation from the organization. I considered my response carefully, balancing professional integrity with recognition of established organizational commitments. Based on the architectural conflicts identified, I would recommend a 3-phase implementation approach, I began, opening a system diagram on my laptop and displaying it on the conference room screen. Phase 1 would transition non-critical processing systems using a parallel implementation that maintains existing architecture while gradually integrating AES capabilities. This allows for pattern recognition development without risking core functionality. I continued with detailed technical recommendations for each phase, emphasizing data integrity protection, client experience continuity, and regulatory compliance maintenance throughout the transition. The presentation reflected genuine expertise without emotional investment in organizational outcomes, professional guidance rather than position advocacy. As I concluded, the room remained momentarily silent, stakeholders processing the comprehensive technical assessment. Vivian broke the silence with characteristic directness. This approach would extend the implementation timeline by approximately 4 months beyond original projections, she observed. The financial implications are significant for both organizations. One of the Neurosphere executives nodded in acknowledgement. Extended implementation increases our resource commitment substantially. Our standard contract structure isn't designed for phased transitions of this duration. The conversation shifted to contract modifications and financial adjustments, areas outside my consulting parameters. I remained present, but uninvolved as administrative negotiations unfolded, observing the familiar dance between technical requirements and financial constraints that characterized enterprise implementation projects. After several minutes of increasingly detailed financial discussion, Dr. Winters spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had built Horizon from startup to industry leader. "Perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong direction," she suggested, the simple statement immediately shifting attention. "We're discussing how to implement a specific solution rather than defining the problem we're actually trying to solve." Vivian looked momentarily disconcerted by this fundamental redirection. "The problem is clearly defined, optimizing operational efficiency through AI implementation. The board has approved this strategic direction." Dr. Winters nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, but artificial intelligence is a means, not an end. The question isn't whether to implement AI, but how to leverage its capabilities while maintaining the resilient architecture that has made our systems trusted by healthcare providers across the country." She glanced toward me briefly before continuing. "I'm reminded of a principle I emphasized during Horizon's early development. Technology serves human needs, not the reverse. Our implementation approach should reflect that hierarchy." The observation subtly reframed the entire discussion, shifting from technology-driven implementation to purpose-focused integration. The Neurosphere executives appeared momentarily unsettled by this perspective adjustment, which implicitly questioned the unilateral replacement approach that had characterized their initial sales proposition. "What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Winters?" Vivian asked, her tone suggesting recognition of the founder's continuing influence despite formal leadership transition. "I'm suggesting we consider a hybrid approach," Dr. Winters replied. "Not replacing human expertise with artificial intelligence, but integrating algorithmic capabilities with human judgment to create systems stronger than either could achieve independently." The concept aligned remarkably with my own emerging thinking about complementary capabilities rather than competitive replacement. Hearing it articulated by Horizon's founder carried significance beyond the specific implementation discussion, suggesting potential broader reevaluation of the relationship between technological advancement and human expertise. Sanjana leaned forward with visible interest. "From a technical perspective, a hybrid approach could actually accelerate certain implementation aspects while mitigating the architectural conflicts we've been encountering." The AES system excels at pattern recognition and operational optimization, but struggles with contextual judgment and exception handling, precisely the areas where human oversight adds significant value. The conversation shifted dramatically following this reframing, moving from timeline adjustments to fundamental implementation reconceptualization. Technical possibilities previously unconsidered emerged as the discussion escaped its original constraint parameters. Throughout this evolution, I contributed technical assessment when directly addressed but otherwise maintained professional reserve, observing the organizational recalibration with analytical interest. After nearly 2 hours of increasingly productive discussion, Vivian called for a brief break before finalizing implementation recommendations. As participants dispersed for coffee and informal conversations, Dr. Winters approached me directly for the first time. "Rebecca, would you join me?" "For a moment?" she asked, gesturing toward a small breakout room adjacent to the main conference area. I followed with professional curiosity, our interaction representing the first direct communication since her retirement 3 years earlier. Though we had worked together for 15 years during Horizon's growth phase, our relationship had been respectfully professional rather than personally close, characterized by mutual technical respect rather than mentor-protege dynamics. The breakout room offered views similar to those from Michael's office, though from a different angle that emphasized the research center where many of Horizon's systems supported clinical trials and data analysis. Dr. Winters closed the door before speaking. "I've been following the situation with interest," she began without preamble. "Vivian contacted me yesterday after the validation system failures, seeking perspective on implementation risks. I requested complete information about the transition approach, including the decision to eliminate your position." Her direct acknowledgement of my termination was unexpected, creating momentary uncertainty about appropriate response. Before I could formulate reply, she continued, "That decision reflects fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes technological infrastructure," she stated, her assessment matching David Zhang's earlier observation with remarkable precision. Systems architecture isn't merely technical implementation, but the embodiment of organizational values and priorities. Your architecture emphasized resilience, adaptability, and contextual awareness, qualities increasingly essential as implementation approaches evolve toward algorithmic standardization. The validation from Horizon's founder carried different significance than similar observations from colleagues or external contacts. Institutional recognition from the organization's originating vision rather than merely personal affirmation. "I appreciate that assessment," I responded simply, maintaining professional composure. Dr. Winters smiled slightly, suggesting recognition of understated response to significant validation. "What are your plans following the knowledge transfer period?" she inquired, shifting from organizational assessment to personal trajectory. The question invited genuine reflection rather than programmed response. "I'm considering several options," I replied truthfully. A traditional position with a healthcare analytics startup, consulting opportunities, potentially independent work exploring integration approaches between conventional architecture and emerging technologies. "All viable paths," she observed. "Though I wonder if you've considered another possibility, one that addresses a market need while leveraging your specific capabilities." Her questions suggested awareness of possibilities beyond my stated options, prompting professional curiosity. "What specifically are you thinking?" "The challenges we're discussing today aren't unique to Horizon," she explained. "Organizations across industries are navigating similar transitions, attempting to implement AI solutions within existing infrastructures, often with inadequate understanding of integration requirements. Many are experiencing precisely the complications emerging here: architectural conflicts, implementation failures, and eventually, reassessment of fundamental approaches." She paused briefly before continuing. "There's significant need for expertise in designing and implementing hybrid systems that leverage both artificial intelligence and human judgment. Not temporary transition consultation, but comprehensive integration architecture. Designing systems that utilize algorithmic capabilities while maintaining essential resilience and contextual awareness. The observation aligned with my own. Emerging recognition of market evolution, though her specific framing suggested more developed conceptualization of potential response. That need certainly exists, I acknowledged, though addressing it effectively would require both technical expertise and organizational influence, capacity to shape implementation approaches at strategic rather than merely tactical levels. Precisely, Dr. Winters agreed, which is why I've been developing a new venture focused specifically on AI integration architecture for complex regulatory environments like healthcare, financial services, and critical infrastructure. Not implementation services, but design frameworks for effective human-AI collaboration in contexts where system failures carry significant consequences. The revelation was unexpected, suggesting the retired founder had been developing new professional direction rather than merely observing industry evolution. That's an intriguing focus area, I noted, particularly given the current market emphasis on replacement rather than integration approaches. Market narratives evolve as implementation realities emerge, she replied with the perspective of someone who had navigated multiple technology cycles throughout her career. The current enthusiasm for wholesale replacement will inevitably confront the limitations we're observing here. Algorithmic systems struggling with contextual judgment and exception handling in complex regulatory environments. Organizations that develop effective integration approaches will demonstrate competitive advantage through superior adaptability and compliance management. Her analysis reflected strategic vision beyond immediate implementation challenges, perspective spanning technology cycles rather than quarterly reporting periods. This longer time frame had always characterized her leadership approach, enabling Horizon's growth through multiple technological transitions while maintaining consistent focus on healthcare infrastructure reliability. You mentioned developing this venture, I observed. Is it already operational? Early stage, she acknowledged. Conceptual framework established, initial client engagement secured, partnership structure defined. What remains missing is technical leadership with specific expertise in enterprise systems, resilience, and adaptive architecture. She met my gaze directly. Someone with demonstrated capability in designing infrastructures that accommodate evolving requirements while maintaining consistent performance across regulatory contexts. The implication was clear, though unstated. Potential opportunity beyond traditional employment or consulting arrangements. That's a specialized capability set, I noted neutrally, neither pursuing nor dismissing the implied proposition. Indeed, she agreed. One developed through extensive experience navigating complexity rather than merely implementing predetermined solutions. Experience that becomes increasingly valuable as organizations recognize the limitations of standardized approaches to contextual challenges. Before further exploration of this potential direction, voices in the hallway indicated the main meeting would soon resume. Dr. Winters glanced toward the door before offering a final observation. The knowledge transfer period concludes next week, she stated. Perhaps we might continue this conversation afterward, when your consulting obligations have been fulfilled. My calendar has availability Wednesday afternoon, if that might work for you. The invitation maintained professional parameters while creating space for potential exploration of alternative opportunities. Wednesday would work well, I acknowledged. I appreciate the perspective you've shared. Perspective becomes valuable when it enables more effective navigation of emerging territories, she replied. Now, we should probably rejoin the implementation discussion before administrative anxieties resurface. We returned to the conference room as others were settling back into their positions. The remaining discussion focused on specific implementation, adjustments following the conceptual reframing toward hybrid approaches rather than wholesale replacement. My contributions remained professionally focused on technical feasibility rather than organizational implications, maintaining appropriate consulting boundaries while providing substantive guidance. By meeting conclusion, a revised implementation approach had been established. Phased transition utilizing parallel processing during initial stages to maintain critical functionality while developing appropriate integration patterns for later phases. The timeline extended significantly beyond original projections, but with specific metrics for progression between phases rather than arbitrary calendar deadlines. As participants gathered materials following adjournment, Vivian approached me, directly for the first time outside the structured discussion framework. "Your technical assessment was quite valuable," she acknowledged, the statement representing significant shift from our termination meeting interaction. "We'd like to extend the consulting arrangement through the revised implementation period, if you're amenable." The offer was professionally flattering, yet potentially limiting, tying me to Horizon's specific implementation rather than exploring broader opportunities suggested by my conversation with Dr. Winters. "I appreciate the offer," I replied. "Once the knowledge transfer concludes next week, I'd be happy to discuss potential ongoing consultation parameters." Vivian nodded, her expression suggesting awareness of deliberately non-committal response. "Of course, we can discuss specific arrangements later this week." As I gathered my materials, Sanjana approached with visible relief at the meeting outcomes. "This revised approach addresses our primary technical concerns," she observed. "The hybrid implementation allows for appropriate pattern recognition, development without risking critical functionality. It's a more realistic approach to complex systems integration," I agreed, "particularly in regulatory environments where contextual judgment remains essential." "Your technical assessment was instrumental in achieving this recalibration," she acknowledged. "Neurosphere would be interested in discussing potential consulting arrangements independent of the Horizon implementation, if that might interest you." The second consulting offer within minutes further validated my expertise while potentially creating competing obligations. "I'm considering several options following the knowledge transfer period," I replied with professional diplomacy. "I'd be happy to discuss possibilities once current obligations conclude." The journey back to my apartment that evening provided valuable reflection space. The day's developments represented significant validation, from founders' recognition to multiple consulting offers, clear confirmation of professional value independent of organizational position. Yet traditional employment or consulting arrangements, however financially attractive, potentially limited exploration of emerging opportunities at the intersection of systems architecture and artificial intelligence integration. The conversation with Dr. Winters had introduced intriguing alternative, potential involvement with early-stage venture focused specifically on integration architecture rather than implementation services. This direction aligned with my emerging understanding of professional value, while potentially offering greater influence on industry approaches to artificial intelligence integration. Upon reaching home, I found an email from David Zhang awaiting response. Polite inquiry regarding my interest in the MedPatterns position following next week's knowledge transfer conclusion. The opportunity remained attractive, offering immediate professional continuity within established organizational framework. Yet it represented essentially lateral movement, rather than evolution toward emerging possibilities suggested by both independent reflection and Dr. Winters' venture description. Rather than immediately responding, I opened my Complexity Frameworks document, the personal manifesto developed during earlier reflection on professional identity and value proposition. The conceptual architecture outlined there aligned remarkably with Dr. Winters' description of integration challenges across industries. What had begun as personal reflection on professional identity now appeared potentially applicable to broader market need for expertise in designing systems that effectively integrated algorithmic capabilities with human judgment. This alignment suggested potential direction beyond specific employment opportunities, Contribution to emerging field of integration architecture for complex regulatory environments. Whether through Dr. Winter's venture, independent work, or other organizational arrangement remained undetermined, but the foundational focus area appeared increasingly clear and personally meaningful. With this clarity, I drafted responses to the day's various propositions, professional acknowledgement of consulting opportunities while deferring specific commitments until after knowledge transfer conclusion, similar response to David Zhang, maintaining potential involvement with med patterns while creating space for alternative consideration, and calendar confirmation for Wednesday's conversation with Dr. Winters to explore her venture concept in greater detail. These responses maintained professional optionality while acknowledging emerging direction preference, focusing on integration architecture for complex regulatory environments rather than specific implementation services or traditional systems, management roles. The distinction felt simultaneously subtle and significant, shift from implementing predetermined solutions to designing frameworks for effective technology integration. As evening progressed, I returned to the simulation model, begun days earlier, continuing exploration of integration approaches between traditional architecture and machine learning capabilities. The activity remained free from employment considerations or implementation constraints. Pure exploration of technical possibilities driven by intellectual curiosity rather than organizational directives. This reconnection with fundamental motivation reinforced emerging professional direction, contribution to effective integration of human judgment and algorithmic processing rather than advocacy for either traditional approaches or wholesale technological replacement. The middle path appeared both technically optimal and personally meaningful, leveraging accumulated expertise while engaging emerging possibilities. The day's experiences had introduced unexpected mentorship at pivotal moment, Dr. Winter's perspective, offering validation of evolving professional identity, while suggesting potential application through her developing venture. Whether that specific opportunity proved optimal remained undetermined, but the fundamental direction alignment appeared significant. Recognition of integration architecture as emerging field requiring specialized expertise in navigating complexity across technological transitions. This clarity provided foundation for approaching remaining knowledge transfer obligations with renewed purpose, fulfilling current responsibilities with professional integrity, while maintaining openness to emerging possibilities beyond horizons. Specific implementation challenges. Whatever specific arrangement eventually materialized, the fundamental value proposition had crystallized. Expertise in designing resilient systems that effectively integrated human judgment with algorithmic capabilities across complex regulatory environments. With this understanding, I continued technical exploration well into evening hours, the work itself providing satisfaction independent of organizational validation or employment considerations. This reconnection with intrinsic motivation represented perhaps the most significant development since termination. Rediscovery of professional purpose, transcending specific institutional roles or technological implementations. The unexpected mentor had catalyzed important recognition that contribution to effective technology integration represented meaningful professional direction aligned with both market evolution and personal capabilities. This clarity would inform remaining decisions following knowledge transfer conclusion, providing evaluation framework for assessing specific opportunities against fundamental purpose direction, rather than merely comparative compensation or status considerations. As midnight approached, I saved the simulation model and prepared for rest, anticipating tomorrow's continued knowledge transfer sessions with renewed perspective. The implementation challenges remained technically complex, but my relationship to them had evolved significantly. From terminated employee documenting replacement process to independent expert contributing to integration architecture evolution. This shift represented not just status recalibration, but fundamental identity transition, from institutional role definition to purpose-driven professional direction transcending specific organizational boundaries. Up next, you've got two More standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.